So we have gathered here for celebrating the annual day 2023, which marks 18 years of excellence in public health by IPH Bengaluru. Thank you. In the year 2018, at IPH Bengaluru, we launched annual public health oration series. The idea of this series was to learn from the life journeys, from contributions and perspectives of eminent individuals who have made significant contributions to public health and the allied disciplines. And we are very privileged that over time we had very inspiring personalities who have delivered this oration in past. Sri K.V. Dhananjay, a prominent advocate at Supreme Court of India, he delivered our inaugural oration in 2018. Dr. Ravi Narayan, a community health scholar and practitioner and activist, he delivered our oration in 2019. In the year 2020, we had Professor Geeta Sen, who is a world-renowned scholar on gender inequality as well as women's rights. We had Dr. C. Madagowda, an eminent social scientist and tribal rights activist, delivering our oration for 2021. And we had Dr. Rupa Devadasan. I'm so glad that she is among us in the room today. An eminent physician, public health practitioners, and educationist. She delivered our oration last year. It's my absolute privilege to introduce Sri Pranay Lal, the orator for this year. I know many of you know him through his books, through his writings. Pranay Lal has a multifaceted personality. He's truly a public intellectual of our times. So his basic training was in biochemistry, but has made significant contributions in several areas, especially environment, public health, and climate science. He's an artist, and he's a very accomplished writer and author. His first book, The Indica, A Deep Natural History of Indian Subcontinent, came out in 2016. Many of you would have heard or read about it. It received several awards, including the Best Non-Fiction Debut Award by Mumbai Lit Fest, and it became 10 most memorable books of the year by Amazon. And very soon, he came out with his another book, The Invisible Empire, The Natural History of Viruses. And again, it was very highly acclaimed and very well received. It was a time when many of us were struggling with pandemic and waking up to learn more about viruses and started seeing viruses in a particular way. At the time, his book provided a deep historical but very wholesome view of the world of viruses in a very, very readable format. I can go on. I don't think my words will do justice in introducing Pranay's work. But let me say that personally, for me, and I know many others like me, he has been an amazing mentor. And we are especially privileged at IPH Bengaluru because he also currently serves as the member of our governing board. So I require all of you to join me in welcoming Pranay Lal for delivering this year's oration, which is on people, planet, and pathogens. Welcome, Pranay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Upen. This is really humbling, and I really mean it. This is a real honor. So thank you so much for inviting me. The honorable board members, colleagues at IPH, seekers of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you to invite me to speak on the 18th anniversary of the Institute. I think such a major accomplishment, given that we are living in such interesting times. Over the past 14 years or so, I've had the privilege of working with several of you, including Upendra. IPH becomes one of my most favorable memories in public health work that I've done. When Dr. Upendra Bhojani invited me to speak today, it came as a pleasant surprise because I had attended the past previous speakers, and it was a tough act to follow, and I formed at the idea that, how could it be possible that you're inviting me? And I wanted to wriggle out of it, but, as luck would have it, I just couldn't. He has immense advocacy and persuasive skills, as you know. So here I am, and I looked at, at the whole concept that, while IPH is such an engaging and a fantastic institute. It's such a collegial environment. I wondered how refreshing it would be that in a world where so many doors are closing in and minds are appearing to bind themselves and adhering themselves to such closed ideas, it is very rare to find an institute where you have independent thought and where ideas and innovation is fostered. So I thought there's no way I should deny this opportunity. This is exactly how even nature works. Nature works through the larger concept of subtle engagements and entanglements. It's that process that makes nature extremely interesting. It's very much like IPH, festering with energy, and there are moments that appear to be lulling over, but beneath that surface, there is a lot of activity, and it's exactly what IPH also stands for. And therefore, just as IPH, you've got these clusters that have been created, life itself has all these small microcosms that are created, which have their own entropies and movement of energies and relationships between organisms and the living and the non-living world that is together. And I find that an incredible story that needs to be told. And that's what makes me excited about looking at landscapes, ecosystems, life forms, all of them which come together to make anything so interesting. So until it arrived on the scene, SARS-CoV-2 was just another virus, living comfortably in the lungs of some mammal in Southeast Asia. And then it arrived suddenly, it took the world by storm. And that isn't what the virus had intended to do, or for that matter, any creature to do, whether it's any other thing that we want to label as a pathogen or a parasite. That's not the intention of a life form. But it was an entirely improbable event. What we saw in terms of SARS-CoV-2 becoming a pandemic was an entirely improbable event because we know this since the 1960s. For example, the US Surgeon General William Stewart, who in 1967 said that it is time to close the book on infectious disease. He said this in his opening speech. He was so confident that we were seeing the last of infectious diseases. And this ebullient optimism of some kind, a rather foolhardiness, was seen also in textbooks. I mean, one of the classics of its time, one of the most read textbooks on infectious disease, went so far as to say in its preface that we would have eradicated all infectious diseases by the year 2000. And here we are, there is no way that we can say this anymore. We eradicated smallpox in 1976. And there was hope that, there are vaccines for other diseases. I mean, there's measles, there's polio, and there are other effective vaccines. But the socio-biopolitical construct of countries and communities is such that disease eradication remains a distant dream. This foolhardy nature of us to imagine that we would be able to eradicate disease, whether it was based on our technological prowess, our funding, our intellectual superiority over nature, international cooperation was growing. All of these would have come together and certainly reduced the burden of disease from infectious disease. Somehow that has not happened. I mean, other than the eradication of smallpox and one other disease which has happened in animals, which is rinderpest, right, which is a relative of measles. Other than that, we have not been successful in eradicating diseases. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of planets, our planet in particular. Now, we are what is called a Goldilocks condition. We have just the right things that happen in the right order and at the right time for life to exist the way it does, right? And when we see life today around us, we know that life exists in a in layers of interconnected relationships that cannot be teased away. You try disturbing one of them, it impacts in some way or the other. There's this epithet that is called of mice and men, which is, a famous epithet, a literary epithet that is used often. But, think about it. Just as we share genes with mice, we are nearly 99.9% similar to mice. And that's why mice are used for, testing in laboratories. We also share a very similar microbiome with them. A microbiome basically is the existence of organisms that are shared within our systems, right? Whether it's the lung of a mouse or a jerboa or another small rodent. And this is what makes the ability of pathogens to jump from mice to men, right? So smallpox, for example, came from mice. It went to perhaps camels or went directly to humans. We don't know, but we know that camelpox, mousepox, and smallpox are very close cousins, right? So that's the beauty of evolution. That's the beauty of how organisms end up colonizing other related and not so related life forms. But as we talk about this, we must also remember that organisms are not just creatures that are there to get you. Remember, there's no agency. Microbes are not there to get you. Think about it. We live in a world that is ruled by microbes. Microbes help us to breathe. They help us to digest. The fact that we have life birth is because of microbes. Otherwise, we would all be born out of eggs. And there's so many other things that we take otherwise for granted. It's because of the microbial world. Now, sounded like Dam Maro Dam, the beginning of that song. It sounds like that. Yeah, okay. So, each organ in our body has a very definite pattern of microbes, how they live and how they colonize us. A natural birth of a baby through a birth canal, we have a layer of lactobacilli, and that's something that gives us protection against other infectious diseases, for example. And it's from birth and even before birth that we get a microbial benediction, a microbial legacy, which is, in a sense, protected. And I think we must, for a moment, not look at microbes as something that are invaders, because what we thought was the final frontier, something that we thought was sacrosanct. For example, we imagine that the spinal fluid of our bodies is immune to any invasion by an organism. But genomic analysis of extremely healthy people, normal people, normal subjects, healthy people with no previous record of meningitis or any other intrusion, found that there are viruses that are lurking there. And we don't know what they're doing there, right? But we know that they give us protection against other viruses. For example, not everybody develops meningitis. And they find that you have a certain type of virus microflora inherent in your spinal fluid, you will not get meningitis. So this is something that has happened only in 2019, a paper that was published in Japan. And so there's so many such things that we discover that it's so recent that we really, really don't know enough about the microbial world and what is the basis of health and disease. And that is now blurring because we live in a time that there is a large gray area and we might well be in the flux of being between disease and health and death. So that spectrum between health and disease is widening. And there's no one else to blame but us. We've created conditions to our bodies and our environment to make it in such a fashion. Now, I think it is therefore important for us to develop this understanding in a broader sense of what the microbial world is and what the physical natural world is in terms of describing what processes of life is. Because if you were to look at the wondrous feats of the microbial world, we can no longer distance ourselves from from this incredible force of nature, whether the living world of microbes or the non-living world of the planetary forces. Think about all the planetary forces that we see, we take for granted. For example, the sun or gravity. The shape of our cells is designed largely by not our genes, but also the first thing that our body encounters, which is gravity. Now, we take all of those for granted. And if you were to start listing down those Goldilocks moments that we've had that give us life on Earth, there is a different story altogether. Now, despite science knowing that microbes can be good, our relationship continues to be tenuous. And I must say this with a bit of sorrow and a bit of anger, that even the medical community is ignorant and has this abhorrence towards the microbial world. And I think this is something that is fed not only as when we were children, that you should not look at dirt and grime and other things, but I think our medical fraternity also tells us that, we have to excessively sanitize ourselves and, build this whole narrative of bias and myths that microbes are bad and they need not be harbored in our body. But nothing can be far from this because, like I mentioned, everything that the microbe does for us is a divine benediction. As a result, what has happened with microbes, and in some ways, I'll come back to climate and planet in a little while, is that we have consigned the microbe and the microbial world at large to the dustbins of science and natural history. And there are very few books or papers or lectures that actually celebrate a microbe or the microbial world, right? Instead, we speak about them in derogatory terms, and we do not give them the recognition that they should be getting for the services they provide. Now, it starts from the very fact that we mislabel microbes. We have very derogatory terms for microbes. We clearly divide, as soon as a microbe is identified, we divide it based on its utility function. If it is useful, it's given a good name, lactobacilli, for example. It means that here is something that is found in milk, and it is something that actually helps in conserving the milk for a short while before it actually starts destroying it. So it's actually good. It's also very good for making yogurt and cheese. So it's a good bacteria to have. But there are many others that actually get an epithet which is very negative. Now, the second part that we do, other than the ones that benefit, are the ones that are pathogens, that we actually have very, cruel names or names that are very, very abusive. And there is a 99.999%, I don't know how large that fraction is, of organisms about which we don't care. We don't have a very, very specific purpose and how we give them a name. Now, the overall idea of microbes is that we have got our whole understanding of the largest kingdom of organisms completely wrong. Now, just to give you an example, until 1998, we did not know which was the largest photosynthesizer on planet Earth. The largest photosynthesizer on planet Earth is a microbe that is found in the top 80 layers of oceans. It's called Prochlorococcus. And it took a woman scientist in MIT 3 full years to convince a supervisor that this is the most abundant bacteria. It is the single biggest photosynthesizer in the world. And it produces nearly 22% of all the free oxygen that you and I breathe, right? And we did not know about it. And even today, the myth persists that it is trees that produce all the oxygen that is free and available to us to breathe. Well, nothing can be far from the truth, because it's the bacteria, the cyanobacteria, the blue-green bacteria in oceans, in ponds, rivers, and all open waters that produce all the free oxygen that you and I breathe. It's not the trees. Now, 70% of the overall free oxygen that is produced on the planet Earth is produced by bacteria alone. and these bacteria, the ones that I talked about, the aquatic bacteria. Now, what makes them very, very important is that their rapid lifestyles, they grow in a very short time cycle of 12 to 24 hours. That's it. That's all they live for. They photosynthesize, absorb carbon dioxide, release oxygen as part of their life cycle, die, and sink down into the ocean. Now, this is the critical aspect of keeping a balance of carbon on the planet. So the trees are not doing the carbon sinking. The carbon sinking happens because of bacteria. So the whole balance that happens on Earth in terms of carbon and the carbon cycle is by bacteria and creatures like them on soils, on moist surfaces like aquatic places. So that's something that I think is very important from the perspective of both the microbial world as well as the way the planet functions. It's an important aspect for us to consider. Now, it's not just the oxygen that we are worried about. I mean, think about it, like I said, the mammalian placenta, the human placenta is a viral benediction. Had that infection not happened in reptiles or an early mammal-like reptile 255 million years ago, you and I would actually be twittering. We would be on Twitter. We would be like birds tweeting. The reason why this happens is because the egg, which was such a vulnerable thing, if you're born out of an egg, you're a very vulnerable creature. First of all, the egg itself is a vulnerable thing, and having a live birth means that you can be up on your feet more quickly. Think about a birth happening in the Serengeti or in the plains of any grassland, where a antelope's calf is ready to walk in 15 minutes or half an hour. It just follows his mother, right? Or her mother. So that is the crucial aspect of being born live, right? Now, the previous story that I told you about oxygen, it's not just about oxygen and carbon. Just about every element that we are talking about is linked to the carbon and the oxygen cycle. So this obsession that we have with carbon sinking, although good for our times, it is an obsession nevertheless, because we should be looking at every aspect of the elemental and the mineral cycle. And who comes to help here? It's the microbes. It's the microbes and the minerals that come together to make sure that the carbon cycle and the oxygen cycle remain stable. You break one of them and you have a problem. So the problem is that we have broken all the element cycles, all the mineral cycles, because of our excessive use of minerals, our excessive use of certain elements, and we've broken landscapes to get them out. Let me give you an example. For example, if you were to talk to microbiologists and geologists, they would tell you that the planetary health and the climate variability cannot be achieved if you were to look at only trees or only about conserving a certain landmass over the other. What we need to look at is the interconnectedness of ecosystems and landscapes together. And within them, the life forms that work with each other in terms of consuming those minerals and soils and humic acid and compost and detritus. All of them are small things that actually matter. Now, let me just give you one example. We use a lot of fertilizer and pesticide that comes from the phosphate rocks, right? I mean, the rocks which have a higher concentration of phosphate, that's where we also get all our material or the raw material for making toothpaste and soaps, right? But think about it. Every morning when we brush and use the soap and we flush it out of our bathrooms or wherever, it goes into a river, it gets concentrated in the river, goes down into some sea, and it starts concentrating there. So you took phosphorus out from one rock, concentrated it, and then put it out in huge numbers every day of just about every year. And the accumulation that's happening in the seas is incredible. And this is not how nature had designed that life cycle of that mineral to happen. And as a result, we have all these blooms that we have in our ponds, in our rivers, and of course the oceans, right? All these blooms that are happening is because of fertilizer, but partly because of the way we use our toothpaste and our soaps, right? So this is just one example, and think about just about every other thing. You can talk about iron, you can talk about potassium, you can talk about any other mineral or element, and you will have the same problem. Now, I just want to say that, all the issues that we are talking about today have to be seen and replaced. So if I'm using the word microbe, you can change the word and say planet, and you'll have the same argument working for you, right? I'm not saying that either of them is exclusive of each other. Planets and microbes and minerals go together, right? Now, I just want you to, I want to just step back, take you back into a bit of history, because today is a historic day. It's 18 years of IPH, so extremely historic day. I just want to take you a little bit in history to understand why we have this historical hate relationship with microbes. I think it starts from the moment when the plagues had ended and the earliest microscopes were invented in Holland and England, between Leeuwenhoek and Robert Hooke. This whole exchange that was happening between Holland, Germany, and England, and a bit of Italy. I mean, the best microscopists of 16th century came from these countries. And what they saw in their skins or in other parts of their body, they were horrified. They were looking at creatures. They found their skins and their plaque and other parts of their body teeming with these organisms. Right? They were not expecting to see organisms in places that they thought were immune, or rather sterile, right? But as a result, the term that was coined at the time was germ, because what they realized was that even if when they isolated a very small portion of what they took from their plaque, it would regrow. So what was left behind in their teeth or say on their skin, it would grow back. So the word germ actually is the same root as germination, means to regrow. But come 17th century, we have another word that comes into existence, and the word is parasite. Now, para means along, and site is to feed. So the word actually means something that sits alongside its host and feeds on it. I mean, you could call one of your co-workers a parasite because that person is feeding off your work. But this is exactly how nature is. But what we are now finding is that there's some parasites that are actually very good for you. Right? For example, there's now evidence that if you have worm infestation in your stomach, you actually have a lower incidence of wheeze, right? And you have a lower incidence of eczema, right? So, those kind of things. So there are people in the West who have had a very sanitized life who are now consuming roundworm eggs, just to infect themselves slightly. And it also avoids Crohn's disease and things like that. Celiac diseases that are happening can be avoided if you have a microflora which has certain creatures, including roundworms. Now, the other aspect that I want to come to, other than the word pathogen, which gives you pathos or parasite or germ, I think these are derogatory terms that came out, and we retain those terms. We tend to not look at the larger problems that exist in the microbial world, at least in our relationship with the microbial world. What has actually happened is that we now recognize that some of these parasites are hitchhikers, and they tend to leave your body even without manifesting a disease, and somehow they just vanish, right? And some of them are stowaways. They just exist and just never show a disease. So although you might be a carrier of a disease, of a pathogen, you may never develop a disease. So these are interesting aspects that we cannot understand of what keeps these organisms in check. Now, I just want to, come to a little bit of statistics. I know most biologists don't like math unless you're a biostatistician, but I just want to tell you about something which is very, very interesting. So until about 1980s or only 1990s, we did not know how many cells exist in us and how many microbes live alongside us, right? So those were very, very interesting times. And so there were some guesstimates that were there. Now, the largest cell in our body, I mean, depending how well nourished or how athletic you are, can be anything between your nerve cell or your fat cell. So if you are slightly obese, your fat cells might be larger than your nerve cells. But both of these are very large cells, right? You could actually see them without the aid of a microscope. Now, they were what is called a Fermi method. You have a back of the envelope method to calculate how many cells are there in your body. And you had a list of cells and you said, oh, if the size is this much of an organ, this is the number of cells that exist. And therefore you came up with a broad number that existed. But there are studies that have happened, especially the ones that have happened in Israel, are fantastic. And what they have found is that the total number of cells in our body in an normal adult male, not obese, not too thin, not too athletic, a normal male. Now, I don't know what a normal Israeli male looks like. But the point is that they calculated that the total number of human cells are 30 trillion. So 30 trillion human cells exist in a normal man, right? So ladies, if there's a man behind you or on your side, he may contain 30 trillion cells. But he also contains 39 trillion bacteria. And this is not counting viruses, which will be more, or protozoa, which will be less, and fungi, which will be even less, right? If you were to add that, it might be maybe another trillion. But the point is that, the ratio of bacterial cell to human cell is 1.3 bacterial cells to one human cell. So we are clearly outnumbered. So if you are going at war with bacteria and the other organisms, you better be sure that, you are completely outnumbered. And if you really want to use excessive antibiotics and other things, they will actually turn against you. So that's not a good state to be in. Women tend to have more microbes in their bodies. And I think the reasons are quite obvious. Children have, again, depends on girl child or a male child. They tend to differ, but they are very similar to an adult male in terms of ratio. The number of cells are, of course, much less. The thing that we did not know, and we got to know only as recently as 2014, was what is it that keeps these microbes that are contesting in our bodies? How do they keep our body in check? Why is it that different organisms are not at war with our organs and our cells, right? Now, this is where something very interesting happens. Think about it. You just had a heavy lunch, right? All of us had a pretty heavy lunch. What prevents the organisms that are going to help us digest, protest, eat all the food, digest it, and start eating our gut lining and start destroying it? They're pretty much capable of doing it, right? But what is it that keeps them in check? And we did not know the answer till as recently as 2014, because there was an accidental discovery of a virus that is an overlord of all these viruses or all these bacteria. And the name that we gave it was a very crass name. It's called the crassphage. So CR is cross, ASS is assembly, and phage is to eat, right? So it's a bacteriophage, that means a bacteria eater. So it's called crassphage. So cross-assembly phage or crassphage is the overlord of what keeps control in our gut. So if you have a gastric reflux that is happening, blame the crassphage for not acting on the upper gastric canal, for not controlling the excessive processes that are the excessive indigestion that is happening. So that's the point that I'm making, that despite living with peace within our bodies, we remain at war with the microbial world. And I think that's the most silly thing that could have happened in terms of what we call advancement. Now, I want you to just think of this thing, that what is the Kannada term or Hindi term or Urdu word or anything for algae, for fungus, for chlamydia, for protozoa, or moss? It's just one word or two words, right? And it is not a good word. Now think about it. Mosses and fungi are so critical on the forest floor for digesting the leaf litter. If that digestion doesn't happen, we'll have leaves that are just there. There's no humus, there is no detritus, there is no enrichment of soil. In fact, there will be no plant world if there are no fungi, right? So think about it. In Hindi, the word I know is kai. Everything is kai, and it's such a dirty word. Anything that is green and greasy along the walls or in wells or in anything is called kai. Now, that's not a word, It doesn't talk about whether it's moss or fungi or any other thing that is, that exists in terms of life form. Now, even in an organic language, an ever-evolving and inclusive language like English, we have bad words. I mean, we've got things like bugs, critters, scum. All these words are very derogatory. In fact, there are companies now named, using these words, and I find that very disturbing. If you were to look at the origin of the word bug, you'll be very disturbed. Trust me, it's a very disturbing word. I don't want to repeat it. There are children here, but perhaps aside we could talk about how that word originated. So I think singularly here, scientists are to blame because they could have changed the discourse. Because not only are they responsible of naming different organisms, but how you should use it is something that is left to them. And whether it's insects, which we call critters, I mean, I find that kind of ridiculous. I mean, I'm not here as an advocate for all living things, but I find that revolting that we call anything and everything critters, scum, and bug, and those kind of words. I think that is something that we need to accord to them is a little more respect and recognition. And I think, if you were to then look at the larger scheme of things, I think we look at nature, the planet, and the microbial world in quite a conceited and a self-obsessed way. We look at just our existence, our biology, our relationships with our food, the organisms that infect us or benefit us, all of this through a keyhole. We do not look at it from the larger remit of things. I think that is troublesome because anything and everything that exists other than that outside of human interest is of no value to us, right? And I think that's a problem. And I think we therefore treat microbes the same way as we treat the planet. And this is a relationship that I want to change. Consider this. I spoke about derogatory names. Think about, again, in Kannada or Hindi or any other thing. We have less charitable words. We have derogatory words for things like deserts or crop forests or wetlands and marshes and even jungles. They're not polite words. Many of them are, if they are assigned to a god or a goddess, it's fine. But otherwise, we have very, very bad words for crop forest, for example. Now, let's look at why is it that we now need to start redefining our relationship with the planet and the microbial world and together. I think we need to do this because we have done very little to celebrate life forms, and the planet we live on. So it's time that we look at ecosystems, landscapes, not just for their functions, but also for what they do as a whole, and without which that interconnectedness would be broken. I want to come back to COVID-19 and, the problem is not over. There are new variants that are emerging. It's like the flu. There are some flus that are more dangerous. The swine fevers just got over in Africa. Thank God it didn't spiral out. But it was something that we should have prevented, but the swine flu emerged and it wasn't handled as well as it should have. Considering that we had come out of a pandemic that should have prepared countries better. But let's go back to COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 happened because of a chance encounter where there was a virus jumping from a mammal into an unsuspecting human, and it spread like a flu, and it spiraled out from one town, and it became what it did, right? Now, This has happened multiple times in the past. It has happened with mice, humans encountering mice or jerboas or pikas, marmots. We've encountered fevers from them. They're chance encounters, whether as hunter-gatherers or agriculturalists, we've got these infections, right? And they have stayed with us. The COVID will stay with us no matter what. Let me just give you an example. An ancestor of COVID affected a population in the Han Chinese 22,000 years ago. It is very, very close to SARS-CoV-2, more close to SARS-CoV-2 than SARS-CoV-1. And this is something that was discovered while the COVID pandemic was running. It was ongoing. And this is something that we now know, because if that fever, that infection had crossed over into humans in the Han population in China 20 to 22,000 years ago, then we know that this crossover is not a new one. It's perhaps happened earlier. So our relationship with this virus, now that it has found a new evolutionary trajectory, it's something that it's going to stay with us, right? Now, I think what we know that the virus has this ability to find cracks in the political and economic systems, amplify itself by finding ways and means in different ways in which health systems work. They know how to create conditions where societies are pushed into new domains. For example, more liberal countries became so much more autocratic. Your personal liberties were taken away from you, right? Now, in countries where liberties were better managed and more participatory, of course, there were smaller countries that had more better governed governments. They fared much better. And I think those are countries that the ones that they exist. But I think the problem here is that we rely far too much on technology to provide us the answers, and we exclude the unimaginable beauty of nature and its powers and the boundless uncertainties under which nature and the microbe operates. Now, I just want to take you to 100 years before COVID-19. I want to take you into a story which I don't think any one of you knows, because I just discovered this about 3 weeks ago. Let me tell you that story. And I think the story is this, that World War I happened starting from 1914 in July. An accidental event triggers different countries in East Europe to begin fighting with each other. They have different motivations. There's no common cause. It was a fight between countries that were colonists versus those who did not have colonies, and others who were struggling to find more colonies. And it was also a clash between former empires, the Ottomans, the Austro-Habsburg, versus those who had empires that had reached further into Asia and Africa, like the British, for example. So World War I was a fascinating time when it comes to looking at public health. And it's something that has not been documented when it is seen from the lens of climate change. Now, here's the story. We know that Napoleon, 100 years earlier, had lost a war while he was trying to wage a campaign against Moscow. It was a terrible El Nino year. El Nino year means that India remains warm, but North Europe and America gets colder, right? And they have an early onset of winter. Now, that happened with Napoleon. It happened in 1919 as well, 1918 actually. Now, in 1918, something happened in America. The cold front that developed in Canada prevented the migration of waterfowl. And as a result, there was a large congregation of water birds in Kansas. Now, that is the point from where our story begins of what is called the Spanish flu, right? Now, this buildup of mallards and ducks, mallards in particular, it's a very pretty duck to look at. It's for those who are birders would know this. It's largely in the family of ducks, but mallards stand out of there because of their very beautiful plumage and color. Mallards are very efficient carriers of influenza virus. But once they know that they they cannot go any further into Canada, or they have to retreat further down. They end up traveling along the climb, what is called a temperature climb. They go along a temperature, along the latitude. And that's what they did in the on the winter of 1918. And that's the moment when America was about to enter the war to liberate Europe, liberate its allies, Britain and France. And there was a chance crossover of this virus from the mallards into trainees who had come for training to this camp in Kansas, where it crossed over. And this became the point where the crossover happens into the first humans, and it stays within the larger remit of the army personnel. It doesn't go out too much because everybody was being shipped from these camps straight to Europe. So America, the population, the public per se, did not suffer as much as the cantonments and the trenches in Europe. But from 1919, this becomes a major problem because influenza gets a hold not only in Europe, but also in other parts of North Africa and wherever there were wars and battles that were happening. At this time, nurses did not know what was killing people. They knew there was something bad in the air. It was simply called miasma. As you remember, everything was miasmic. And the only way they could recognize that a patient had this disease was looking at their soles. Anybody who developed small purple patches on their feet, or cyanosis, as we know, was actually carted out even while alive in the winter to die. And this is the time when, the decision of ethic and careful use of resources and every other thing becomes very, very important. Now, what is remarkable for us is that we need to look at the whole trajectory in which the Spanish flu, and the word Spanish flu also is perhaps the first infodemic because Spain was a neutral country. And it was the only country that was able to send these reports to the rest of the world that we have a problem in Europe. There is a massive epidemic in the trenches that is happening. And because of which, the news, because it came from Spain, it was called the Spanish flu. Spain actually did not have a problem. It only had a problem after people came there for recovery and rehabilitation. It was only then that Spain started to get the effect of the Spanish flu. And of course, when it came to India, there were 67,000 Indians had died in the war, and 12 million people died in World War I. Compared to that, 50 million people died because of the Spanish flu that happened in 1918 and 1919, 1920 for 3 years. And compared to the 67,000 people who died, Indians who died fighting the war for the British in Europe, 12 million people died in India from the Spanish flu, right? So that was the larger remit of how climate variability in New Year, stopping the migration of mallards, they get concentrated in Kansas, that crossover happens into a very large concentration of young men who've come for training, and they go to Europe, and then they spread the flu. Now that's where the climate story happens, and you will not find it in any textbook or any book for that matter, because I have not found it. I just found it in a couple of Canadian researchers who were looking at bird migration and a few other papers, and just putting those stories together, you see this larger picture emerging. I want you to come to another story that I think is forgotten by most medical practitioners, and that's how human agency creates a new infection, or rather a pathogen for itself. Now, until the 1970s, there was a bacteria called Acinetobacter baumannii. It's a rather innocuous bacteria in its natural condition, and was seen as a low-risk pathogen. That's how it was titled. But during the Iraq War, American soldiers who got injured in Iraq and other places around it got this infection in their lungs and their skin. And it soon got called Iraqibacter. And because they did not know what this pathogen was, they gave second and third generation antibiotics to this bacteria. And as a result, it developed very, very strong antibiotic resistance. And today, this bacteria is actually a bacteria that seeks out an infection. In the sense, earlier it was more sedate and a complacent infector. But today, because of its pathogenicity, which has been triggered by antibiotic resistance, it has actually become a frontline pathogen. And in fact, the Infectious Disease Society of America lists it in its top 5, along with Staphylococcus aureus, as one of the most aggressive bacteria in the world. So from being nowhere on that list to being right up there is a very strong journey. And we have this problem now. And WHO currently says there's 700,000, 7 lakh people who die prematurely because of antimicrobial drug resistance in all forms of diseases, which is going to increase to 10 million by 2050. And they've just revised their numbers to 14 million, by 2050. So this is where I think we are creating monsters out of microbes when they should have been none. So I think our real challenge is that even for unknown pathogens or things that were reluctant pathogens, we've converted them into pathogens. And I think it's clearly the mismanagement and negligence that we have done towards the organisms and the microbial world. I just want to leave one final thought with you, and that is looking at what actually is critical in terms of looking at the planetary health and the pandemic that we just suffered. So, like I said, in both the pandemics are clear indications that something was broken. And the first one was a complete chance introduction. The second one was one in which our perverse market incentives and our misplaced priorities exist. Clearly, we should have banned all wildlife trade after SARS-CoV-2. In fact, the most recent reports suggest that actually the wildlife trade has increased. And this is certainly not the way to go forward if we want to look at pandemic control in the future. So I think that is something which is remarkable that we have to look at. And let me remind you once more that microbes are blind. They are, like I said, a complete chance event. They are not directed towards you to infect you. They are not at war with you. So you can't be at war with them. You can't be identifying Klebsiella here and Proteus here or Staphylococcus here because you can't do that, right? So what are you war against? You are at war after the infection happens inside you. You want to overdose yourself with antibiotics and you turn the gun towards yourself. Now that's where the problem is. Now, the other thing that we must remember is that once a crossover of a virus or any pathogen happens, the passage of the pathogen is normal within the animal reservoir. It does not kill the animal. It kills the human, right? So look at SARS-CoV-2. We had dogs, cats, tigers, minks, ermines, toads, all of them getting infected. None of them died. The mortality was in humans, right? So where are we getting the story wrong, right? The story is at several levels that the pieces are broken, which is why it multiplies many-fold. And that's the reason why the evolutionary trajectory of a creature that should have been a moribund, it should have been the end of the road at that reservoir, was created by us. And therefore, we have created problem upon ourselves and we haven't learned yet. Like I said, animal trade is continuing. And that's only one of the problems. There's several others that we need to look at. I think, let me just try enumerating and summarizing what happened in both the large pandemics. I think, first of all, because the governments have not been honest with each other, we really don't know what happened in each country, right? We only have reports of international agencies and civil society records, no government has actually done a full commission on what actually happened in these countries. In fact, there should have been an international commission inquiring on the role of international agencies, international cooperation, and treaties. None of that happened. Nobody was held accountable. No politician, no multilateral organization is responsible for the numbers of death that happened. Now, we know that every government, including our own, has only offered band-aids, and while the public health system was hemorrhaging, there was very little that we did then, and there's very little that we do now because it's back to business as usual. And I think what it has given us is something that is completely wrong. We've actually increased the biophobia and created an even more sanitized world. Now, the word sanitized also is a problematic word because it comes from sanity. Now, I think it is actually insanity that has happened. It's not the sanitization is insanity in some sense. I think, the COVID crisis for us has left behind, is behind us, but it's far from over. I think, the twin peaks that happen in India and say countries like Italy, which had 3 peaks, unfortunately, shows that the planet is very sick. And as are we. I think we are very sick as well. And what it actually indicates is that we have a pretty toxic relationship with the microbial world and the planetary systems that run it. Now, if we want to secure our future, we must have the humility to understand microbes, the planet's own services, its processes, and what is our role in it. And I'm sure that there are no easy answers, but the fact that if we start asking this question, we may be able to find some answers. Thank you so much.